Hello, everyone. Today I will be discussing with you all the Great Migration. I chose to write about and research about the Great Migration as a pivotal point in American history because it is actually a very critical movement that redefined what the American identity is in both the North and the South from an African American perspective, but it also serves as the point to where African Americans really began to create an identity for themselves that was removed from the South and the slave era. So I'm really excited to speak with you all about that today. So the Great Migration, or the relocation of more than 6 million African Americans from the rural South to cities of the North, began in 1916 and sort of went through and came to a halt at around 1970. And had an obvious major impact on urban life in the United States. Many African Americans in the South were motivated to leave their homes simply based off the unsatisfactory economic opportunities that were in the South, as well as the harsh segregation laws that they were forced to essentially deal with. They decided to move to the North, where they were able to take advantage of the industrial opportunities that existed due to World War One taking place. So, as a result of World War One, many cities such as Chicago, New York, and Detroit and St. Louis saw their black populations rise and expand very quickly because they were there to work. Migrants were forced to deal with a lot of the poor working conditions and competition for living space, as well as a lot of the racism and prejudice that existed in the North as well. During the Great Migration, African Americans began to build a new place for themselves in the public sphere. They faced economic confrontation as well as a lot of the political and social challenges that they needed to overcome in order to create a new Black urban culture that would permeate through generations in America to come. So after the Civil War Reconstruction period ended around 1876, white supremacy began to take on a new form through Jim Crow laws, which essentially became the laws of the land in the South. Southern blacks were forced to make a living through working in land as part of a sharecropping system, which offered little to no way of economic growth or mobility. Um, and the Ku Klux Klan, which began to intimidate African American groups in the South in an underground manner, continued to perpetuate violence through lynching and other practices in the South that really just prohibited African Americans the opportunity to participate publicly in the political system and the economic system. Their social mobility was extremely limited, and they were bounded by space constraints, educational constraints, and different things, which continue to perpetuate the marginalization that they faced in the South. So when World War One broke out in around 1914, industrialized urban areas in the North, the Midwest, and the West faced an extreme shortage of industrial laborers. Many of the workers were white males and they had to go fight in the war, and the other workers were there through European immigration. And because of the war, that immigration came to a halt. But war production kicked into high gear, and these industrial factories really needed people to fill these spaces to work, and that enticed African Americans to essentially move from the South to the North to work in these spaces. Many Black newspapers, such as the Chicago Defender, published about the great opportunities that were there and available in the North for African Americans to really take advantage of. And if you think about it, it sounds very familiar to how um, the original settlers came to America. They came to these lands for new opportunity, and they heard about all of the great opportunity for life and liberty that existed here in America, which then in turn um, made them come to America in droves. So one could say that the Great Migration, in many ways, is similar to the migration for British people to move here to America to really just take part on a lot of those new economic opportunities that existed. So by the end of 1919, going into the 1920s, close to 1 million African Americans had left the South. They were traveling by boat, train, bus, any way that they could get to the North to participate in these opportunities. And a major Black population began to grow in these cities. In New York, by 1920, 66% of the city was African American and had grown. In Chicago, the African American population had grown by 148%. Here in Detroit, that population had grown by 611%. So many of these new arriving African Americans found jobs in factories, slaughterhouses, and different types of spaces that were very difficult working conditions and extremely dangerous as well. With this influx of workers also came an influx of competition for employment, right? There were so many people coming, but there were only so many jobs available. And with this employment competition, also came competition for living space. These cities continually became crowded and overcrowded in a sense. And though segregation wasn't legal in the South wasn't legal in the North as it was in the South, racism and prejudice was still widespread. And many of the residential neighborhoods, for instance, an example of this would be that many of the residential neighborhoods of the North enacted covenants that um, gave white property owners the ability to not sell to Black potential buyers. Rising rent in segregated areas and also the resurgence of Ku Klux Klan activity in the North really worsened conditions for African Americans in the North, almost just as bad as they were in the South for sure. Um, as a result of these housing tensions and these racial tensions in the North, many African Americans ended up creating their own cities within big cities. I think a prime example of this would be the birth of Harlem in New York. Formerly an all white neighborhood, by the 1920s, Harlem had housed close to 200,000 African Americans, and the Black experience from the perspective of this, the Black experience during the Great Migration became known as an opportunity for Blacks to really take place in the artistic and the educational movement, which was birthed in the Harlem Renaissance. The Great Migration also served as a new era for African Americans to increase their political activism, especially coming from a space of being disenfranchised in the South. In the North and the West, African Americans really had the opportunity to publicly participate in a lot of the political movements that were taking place. Um, so, towards the 1930s, coming off of the heels of the Great Depression, the first wave of the Great Migration did slow down a little bit, but it did pick back up with the onset of World War II, again, with those job opportunities being abundantly available. Towards the 1970s is where we really see the Great Migration kind of come to a halt as far as the actual movement in such massive droves go. But the demographic and the economic impact by that time of the Great Migration was unmistakable. Whereas in 1900, 9 out of every 10 African Americans lived in the South, and 3 out of 10 of them worked in some form of an agricultural system. By the 1970s, the South was home to actually less than the country's African Americans, with only 25% still living in rural areas of the South. So the Great Migration changed what that makeup looked like. For a group of people to have predominantly lived in the South under such heinous racial segregation, they moved to the North, where opportunity to obtain what we think the American dream to be was there. And it changed the makeup of those cities. It changed the urban demographic of those cities. It changed the culture of those cities. Many African Americans of the South brought with them a lot of those cultural pieces that and traditions that were carried through the transatlantic slave trade and were honed on and held onto during the slave era. And we see traces of that in African American families in the North today. And again, the makeup of identity of those urban areas looks different. Cities like Chicago and Detroit and Milwaukee and St. Louis and Harlem, for instance, have such a vibrant urban spirit around them, which is due to that Great Migration. And I think one of the biggest pieces of the Great Migration is the fact that it gave African Americans the opportunity to openly create an identity for themselves. As we see with the Harlem Renaissance, African Americans got the opportunity to express their artistic creativity. They got the opportunity to publicly explore academia. They got the opportunity to create movements that resulted in the civil rights movement, that resulted in the Black arts movement of the 70s. And it created outlets and it created spaces for African Americans to really publicly express. All of the completeness of what it means to be an African American in the greater American society. And I think without the Great Migration, that opportunity wouldn't have been as overtly available as it was in the South. And moving north really gave African Americans the opportunity to push towards their freedom. And knowing that my family, migrated to the North during that second wave of the Great Migration, right? During that second wave of the Great Migration, and towards the Civil Rights Movement, for me, it's a phenomenal space in my own personal history as well. So I really hope that you guys enjoy reading the essay. Please feel free to ask me any questions if you have them. And I hope that this presentation gave you insight to what my essay is more about. And I hope you find the topic interesting. Thank you so much.